The air inside the packed chamber felt heavy, the overhead lights throwing sharp beams across polished wood and solemn faces. Cameras clicked into place, their lenses trained on the most senior justice in the room. Clarence Thomas leaned back in his chair with the ease of someone untouchable, his voice low but laced with a smugness that seemed to echo louder than the microphone. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, pausing just long enough to let the condescension settle. "Perhaps before offering lectures on constitutional law, you might want to revisit the basics. These matters are far beyond the reach of first-term politicians." A ripple of uncomfortable chuckles moved through the room. His eyes narrowed, his lips curling into the faintest smirk, as if daring her to respond. The air was charged with that familiar power dynamic, the seasoned figure on high, dismissing the newcomer as irrelevant. But then the cameras cut to Jasmine Crockett. She sat tall, her hands steady, her expression composed, yet electric. The lights carved out her features with cinematic precision, sharp cheekbones, determined eyes, the quiet fire of someone who had fought too many battles to flinch now. She did not frown. She did not rush to defend herself. Instead, she let silence work in her favor, the stillness amplifying the arrogance of the man across from her. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the entire nation leaned in closer, waiting to see if she would crumble or cower. But Crockett's eyes told a different story, one of resilience, one of calculation. This wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, and it certainly wouldn't be the last time she turned someone's mockery into their undoing. The narrator's voice sliced through the tension like a drumbeat. What happened next left even the most powerful man on the bench struggling for words. The audience watching at home could feel it too, the vibration of a confrontation teetering on the edge of history. Thomas believed he had shut her down, but Crockett's silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Behind that calm stare was a storm waiting to be unleashed. And when she finally spoke, it would not only shatter the smug grin on Clarence Thomas's face, but ignite a ripple across the country. Because this wasn't just a clash between two public figures. This was about dignity versus disdain, truth versus arrogance. And America was about to witness a moment they would never forget. But before that moment arrived, the stakes would rise higher than anyone imagined. The chamber that afternoon was more than a room filled with polished wood and constitutional debate. It was a stage where America's deepest tensions played out in real time. On one side sat Clarence Thomas, a man whose decades on the bench had made him a symbol of permanence, immovable, untouchable, and cloaked in the authority of lifetime power. He was not merely speaking as a justice. He was speaking as the embodiment of an establishment that too often dismissed new voices, younger voices, female voices, and above all, black voices that dared to challenge the hierarchy from outside its carefully guarded gates. To Thomas, his words were effortless. They cost him nothing. With a smirk and a dismissive tone, he could reduce an elected lawmaker to a student fumbling in a classroom. For him, belittlement was not risk, it was ritual. And yet, beneath that ritual lay a truth he did not acknowledge. The country was no longer content to bow its head in silence. Enter Jasmine Crockett. She did not arrive in Congress with dynastic wealth or the polished veneer of Ivy League privilege. Her credentials were born of long nights in courtrooms defending clients who had no one else, of family roots in Texas that taught her grit before she knew what politics even meant. To the establishment, she was easy to underestimate. Too new, too bold, too unwilling to defer. But to those watching who had ever been silenced, ever been talked over, ever been told they didn't belong, she was something else entirely. She was theirs. The tension between these two figures was more than personal. It was generational. It was cultural. It was about what America values: the untouchable seniority of entrenched power, or the rising fire of lived experience and unshakable truth. Every viewer could sense the stakes. This wasn't merely about legal interpretation. It was about whether a woman who had spent her career fighting for everyday people would be dismissed in the very halls where those people's voices were supposed to matter most. Thomas leaned on decades of insulation, but Crockett leaned on something far stronger: preparation. She had come not just with her story, but with the receipts, case law, precedent, history itself. And while Thomas was used to speaking without challenge, she was prepared to deliver a challenge so precise it would leave him scrambling for footing he had always taken for granted. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on the audience. Social feeds lit up in real time, viewers tweeting about the justice's smug tone, about the congresswoman's unshaken poise. The clash was already resonating as more than just an exchange of words. It was a metaphor, old power mocking new power, confident that nothing could topple it. But here's where the drama thickened. Because Crockett wasn't just another politician looking for a soundbite. She wasn't there to score points or simply hold her ground. She was there to flip the script entirely. To show that even the most revered figure could be held accountable when truth was wielded with courage. And in doing so, she would make it clear that America's future did not belong to the smug comfort of dismissive elitism. It belonged to the voices that refused to be silenced. The nation watched, riveted, as silence stretched between them. Clarence Thomas thought he had finished the exchange. What he didn't realize was that his arrogance had only set the stage for what was to come. Jasmine Crockett's moment had arrived, and with it, the beginning of a confrontation that would soon ripple far beyond the chamber walls. Because the stakes were no longer just legal, they were moral, they were generational, they were personal, and what happened next would prove that the underdog does not simply survive the condescension of power, she turns it into the spark that ignites her greatest victory. But before Crockett delivered that thunderous response, the audience would first see just how high the pedestal was from which Clarence Thomas prepared to fall. To understand why Clarence Thomas's words cut with such cold arrogance, one must first understand the man himself, the shadow he has cast over American law, and the contradictions that follow him like an echo. For more than 3 decades, Thomas has occupied one of the 9 most powerful seats in the country, his black robe draped not only in authority, but also in controversy. Unlike many of his colleagues, he rarely speaks during hearings, projecting an aloof silence that has long been interpreted as indifference, even disdain. When he does break that silence, it is often to dismiss arguments that challenge his rigid worldview, a worldview forged not in the fires of empathy, but in the marble halls of privilege and insulation. Thomas has built his legacy on invoking law and order, presenting himself as the defender of constitutional purity. Yet time and again, his decisions have aligned with those who wield power unjustly, rather than those who seek protection under the law. He has voted to limit voting rights in communities of color, to gut protections that once served as the backbone of civil rights, to shield corporations while leaving everyday Americans exposed. His robe may symbolize justice, but his rulings too often side with entrenched interests over ordinary people. And then, of course, there are the contradictions that cling to his career like oil on water. He speaks of the sanctity of the law, but questions about his own ethical conduct refuse to fade. Reports of lavish gifts, luxury trips, and cozy relationships with wealthy benefactors have painted a troubling picture of a man who rails against corruption while benefiting from its embrace. Each revelation has chipped away at the credibility of the court itself, yet Thomas has remained unrepentant, his silence serving as a shield against accountability. This duality, his lofty rhetoric about integrity versus the murky reality of his associations, has fueled a growing anger among those who see the justice not as impartial but as compromised. To them, his dismissive treatment of critics is not a show of strength, but a mask, hiding the vulnerability of someone who knows his pedestal is not as stable as it appears. And yet, Thomas has mastered the art of arrogance. He leans into it with the certainty of a man who believes history will protect him. He is untouchable, he seems to say. His lifetime appointment a fortress against the tides of change. When younger lawmakers or activists question his decisions, he responds not with openness, but with mockery. He waves away their arguments as juvenile, their concerns as naive, their voices as inconsequential compared to his decades of tenure. It is this air of invincibility that made his condescension toward Jasmine Crockett sting so deeply. It wasn't just one man mocking one woman, it was the embodiment of entrenched elitism ridiculing the voice of a rising generation. For those watching, his smirk symbolized every boss who dismissed their ideas, every official who ignored their struggles, every gatekeeper who told them they didn't belong. His demeanor was not merely personal arrogance, it was systemic arrogance. Yet arrogance, history reminds us, is the prelude to downfall. By painting himself as the untouchable arbiter of truth, Thomas has created a stage ripe for dramatic irony. His critics know his record, know his contradictions, and know that the higher he holds himself, the farther he has to fall. Every dismissive wave of his hand only fuels the anticipation for the moment someone will finally pierce the armor of his smug certainty, and that is what made this confrontation electric. Here was a justice who had spent years towering over dissent, a man who rarely acknowledged those who dared challenge him, now choosing to single out Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman, a black woman from Texas, someone he believed would crumble beneath the weight of his authority. But his miscalculation was fatal. Because what Thomas could not see, what arrogance blinded him from recognizing, was that Crockett was not entering this fight alone. She carried with her the voices of those who had been silenced, the experiences of those who had been dismissed, the credibility of years in courtrooms where stakes were measured not in prestige but in human freedom. Viewers at home could feel the contradiction pressing against the screen. Thomas, cloaked in robes and status, representing the brittle old guard of unaccountable power. Crockett, steady and unflinching, representing the raw force of truth and lived experience. His arrogance was not simply a character flaw, it was the fuel that made what was about to happen inevitable. And so, as Thomas leaned back that day, lips curled into a condescending smile, it wasn't just a dismissal of one congresswoman. It was the dismissal of everyone who had ever been told they were not enough, who had ever been laughed at by those in power. His smirk was their insult. His arrogance was their wound. But arrogance, like glass, can shatter with one well-aimed strike. And Jasmine Crockett had come prepared with the hammer. Her story, her journey, and her unshakable preparation were about to collide with Clarence Thomas's smug certainty, and the impact would be explosive. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever sat across from Clarence Thomas beneath the harsh glare of cameras and power, she was a young woman in Texas, standing on ground where the weight of history pressed heavy. The South is not gentle with those who refuse to stay silent. It tests them, it pushes them, it dares them to rise above the barriers laid in their path. Jasmine's life was a testimony to that test, and to the resilience it forged. Born and raised in Texas, she learned early what it meant to fight for dignity. The lessons weren't found in ivory towers or cloistered classrooms, but in everyday struggles. Families fighting to keep their homes, workers standing up against exploitation, neighbors navigating systems designed to keep them on the margins. Where others saw obstacles, she saw people deserving of defenders. That clarity of purpose carried her into law school, a journey that was anything but easy. Nights hunched over books, mornings facing professors who doubted her, and countless reminders that the space she occupied was not always built for her. But Jasmine didn't just occupy space, she claimed it. She graduated from the University of Houston Law Center with honors, her degree not just a credential, but a declaration. She was here to fight for those the system overlooked. When she entered the courtroom, she carried that same fire. Picture it, a cramped county courtroom in Dallas, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, her client, a young black man barely out of his teens, sitting beside her with fear etched into his face. The prosecutor rattled off charges with mechanical detachment, as if lives were just items on a docket. But Jasmine leaned forward, voice steady, eyes sharp, dismantling the case point by point. To her, it wasn't just about legal arguments. It was about reminding the room that this client was human, deserving of fairness, dignity, and hope. Time after time, she stood in those courtrooms. Civil rights cases, criminal defense trials, families who couldn't afford top-tier representation found in her someone who would not only argue the law, but embody their fight. She wasn't the lawyer who saw clients as files. She saw them as stories, as neighbors, as people who deserved more than the system was willing to give. Her reputation grew, not because she sought the spotlight, but because her results spoke louder than any campaign slogan ever could. She became known as the fighter who walked into the hardest cases and refused to back down. Judges respected her preparation, opponents bristled at her relentlessness, and communities that had been ignored, written off, or silenced, found in her a rare champion who spoke their language and understood their struggle. But Jasmine's fight didn't stop in the courtroom. The cases she took revealed patterns, injustices woven into the very fabric of policy. It wasn't enough to win one trial at a time. To change the system, she would have to step into the halls where laws were made. And so, with the same determination that carried her through late nights of study and long days of courtroom battles, she ran for office. It wasn't a campaign backed by deep-pocketed donors or legacy connections. It was grassroots, neighbors knocking on doors, supporters volunteering their time, ordinary people putting their faith in someone who had never forgotten them. And against the odds, Jasmine Crockett won. She entered Congress not as a career politician polished by decades of Washington deal-making, but as a fighter forged in the trenches of real life. In the halls of the Capitol, she carried herself with the same unflinching poise she had in the courtroom. While others postured, she prepared. While others dismissed her as new, she listened, she learned, and she spoke with a clarity rooted not in theory, but in experience. Her presence was a reminder that power did not belong exclusively to those who had hoarded it for generations. It could be reclaimed by those who had lived the struggles most Americans knew too well. What made her different was not simply her background, it was the way she connected. She spoke about justice not in abstract terms, but in vivid images. The single mother working 3 jobs, the young man pulled over for no reason other than the color of his skin, the family whose home was lost because of predatory practices. To her, politics was not about prestige, it was about people. And so, when she sat in that chamber facing Clarence Thomas, her calm was not surprising to those who knew her story. She had been here before. Not in front of a Supreme Court justice, perhaps, but in rooms where people in power tried to belittle her, where her very presence was questioned. She had survived that test too many times to flinch now. The cameras may have shown a freshman congresswoman seated across from one of the most powerful men in America, but what they didn't show was the lifetime of preparation behind her gaze. They didn't show the courtroom victories, the battles fought on behalf of those who had no voice, the years of resilience built from being underestimated. That's why her silence in the face of Thomas's mockery wasn't weakness. It was strength. It was strategy. It was the patience of someone who knew that arrogance always creates its own downfall, and that truth, delivered calmly, precisely, at the right moment, can dismantle even the most fortified walls of power. Jasmine Crockett was more than a congresswoman. She was a symbol of every underdog who had been counted out, every fighter who had been told they weren't ready, every ordinary person who had been dismissed by the smug elites of the world. And it was precisely that experience, the resilience of her Texas roots, the scars of courtroom battles, the victories carved from nothing, that would make her ready for this moment. Because the stage was set, the lights were burning, and Clarence Thomas was about to learn that underestimating Jasmine Crockett was the gravest mistake he could make. The air in the chamber was charged, the kind of tension you could feel in your chest before a word was even spoken. Clarence Thomas leaned back in his chair, the faintest curl of a smile on his lips, the expression of a man who had already decided the outcome before the argument began. His voice dropped low, deliberate and dripping with superiority as he leaned into the microphone. "Congresswoman," he began, drawing out the title as though it were a formality he found amusing, "your remarks suggest a fundamental misunderstanding of the law. Perhaps, just perhaps, you should revisit the basics before lecturing this body." The words echoed, harsh under the fluorescent lights, like the crack of a gavel meant not to maintain order, but to enforce humiliation. A murmur swept through the room, staffers shifting in their seats, reporters scribbling faster, cameras zooming in. It wasn't the first time Thomas had spoken with such disdain, but this time felt different. This time, all eyes were fixed, not on him, but on the woman across from him. Jasmine Crockett did not blink. She sat still, shoulders squared, her hands folded neatly before her. Where others might have flushed, fumbled, or rushed to defend themselves, she remained calm. The calm wasn't silence, it was strategy. She let the weight of his insult hang in the air just long enough for everyone to feel it, to recognize its condescension, to see the arrogance behind the smirk. Then, with deliberate control, she leaned forward. "Justice Thomas," she said, her tone measured, "with all due respect, what you call a misunderstanding of the law is, in fact, the lived reality of millions of Americans who face its weaponization every single day." The words were not loud, but they struck like a stone against glass. The room shifted, reporters exchanging quick glances, knowing they had just heard the first crack in the armor. Thomas chuckled, low, dismissive. "Reality, Congresswoman, is not defined by emotion. It is defined by the Constitution. If you are confused about that distinction, I would be glad to recommend some introductory reading. There it was again, that blend of smugness and mockery, the tone of a professor indulging a student he believed unworthy of his class. But Jasmine Crockett was no student, and this was no classroom. This was her arena, too, and her restraint was not weakness. It was the deliberate pacing of a fighter waiting for the perfect opening. She let his words land, then tilted her head ever so slightly, eyes narrowing with the kind of fire that comes not from anger, but from conviction. "I assure you, Justice Thomas," she replied, "I've read the Constitution. I've also read the cases where it has been twisted, diluted, and bent to protect the powerful at the expense of the powerless. That, sir, is what we are here to discuss." The chamber erupted, half in stifled gasps, half in hurried typing as fingers raced across keyboards to capture the exchange in real time. Thomas's smirk wavered, just for a moment before returning with hardened resolve. He leaned forward now, his voice sharpening. "You are engaging in rhetoric, not law. This grandstanding may play well on television, but it lacks substance. The court does not deal in narratives, Congresswoman. It deals in precedent, something you appear determined to ignore." Crockett did not flinch. Her hands remained folded, her posture unbroken. "Precedent," she said slowly, carefully, "is not an idol to be worshipped when it perpetuates injustice. It is a tool meant to serve justice, and when precedent betrays that purpose, it must be challenged. Otherwise, the law becomes nothing more than a shield for corruption." The words cut sharper than any raised voice could. They weren't shouted. They were delivered like a verdict, firm and undeniable. Viewers watching at home could feel it, the slow, deliberate way she built her case, brick by brick, refusing to be rattled by insults. Thomas's patience began to crack. He raised his chin, his voice louder now, sharper, the mask of aloof superiority slipping into something more defensive. "Congresswoman, your position demonstrates exactly why inexperienced voices should tread carefully when speaking of constitutional matters. Passion does not replace understanding." The insult hung there, harsher this time, meant to wound. It was the kind of line designed to belittle her, to reduce her to nothing more than an emotional outsider who should know her place. But Jasmine Crockett refused to give him that satisfaction. Instead, she smiled, small, steady, and unshaken. And in that smile, the audience could see what Thomas could not: confidence, preparation, the quiet certainty of someone who had been underestimated all her life and had learned to turn that underestimation into her sharpest weapon. She leaned forward again, her voice calm but carrying just enough edge to command the room. "You're right about one thing, Justice Thomas. Passion doesn't replace understanding. But neither does arrogance." The room froze. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They cut deeper precisely because they were measured, precise, and true. For the first time, Clarence Thomas shifted in his seat, his composure faltering ever so slightly. The condescension that had dripped so easily from his words no longer carried the same weight. Jasmine Crockett held his gaze, letting silence do what no insult could: magnify the moment. And then, with a calmness that electrified the room, she reached for the stack of papers before her. Her voice lowered, deliberate, and steady. "And since you insist on questioning my understanding, let's take a look at the record." The shuffle of paper against wood echoed like the drawing of a sword. The audience leaned forward. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Even Thomas's smirk wavered again, the faintest flicker of unease crossing his face. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just going to respond with words. She was about to pull out receipts, and what she revealed next would leave the chamber reeling. The chamber stilled as Jasmine Crockett laid her papers neatly on the desk before her. No rush, no flurry, just calm, deliberate movement that seemed to stretch time itself. The pause was long enough for every camera lens to zoom in, for every journalist's pen to hover midair, for every viewer at home to lean closer to their screens. She looked directly at Clarence Thomas, her eyes unblinking. "Justice Thomas," she began, her voice steady, "you've suggested I don't understand constitutional law. Let's examine that." The first sheet slid across the desk. United States v. Nixon, 1974. A unanimous decision that limited executive privilege, making clear the president is not above the law. Chief Justice Berger's opinion left no ambiguity, yet your recent interpretation expands privilege beyond recognition. Which is it? Do we honor the unanimous court, or do we rewrite it to suit convenience? The chamber rustled. Thomas's jaw clenched. He adjusted his glasses, but said nothing. Crockett didn't wait for a reply. The second sheet followed. McCulloch v. Maryland, 1819, the principle of federal supremacy. Yet, in recent cases, you've suggested states can defy federal protections on voting rights. How does one reconcile your oath to the Constitution with the willingness to undermine its very supremacy clause? A ripple of gasps. Reporters' heads swiveled back and forth between her and Thomas like spectators at a championship bout. Thomas leaned toward his microphone, his voice harder now. Congresswoman, you are oversimplifying. But Crockett cut him off, her tone unyielding. No, Justice Thomas, I am clarifying. There is a difference. The audience erupted in murmurs. On Twitter, hashtags were already trending. #Crockett Vs. Thomas and Josh receipts season. Memes popped up within seconds. Split screens of Crockett calmly citing case law next to Thomas scowling in silence. One viral tweet read, "Sis brought a syllabus to the showdown. Professor Thomas looking like he skipped class." Crockett pressed forward. Her voice was firm, clipped, surgical. You've claimed consistency in your views on impeachment, yet in 1998, during the Clinton proceedings, you stated a crime was not necessary. In 2019, defending Trump, you said the opposite. Which version of Justice Thomas are we supposed to believe? The one who applies law evenly, or the one who bends with the political wind? She slid another sheet forward, the documentation of his conflicting words. Cameras zoomed in, catching Thomas's face tightening, his nostrils flaring as he tried to compose himself. The crowd's whispers rose into audible gasps. A few staffers in the back even covered their mouths, unable to hide their shock. Crockett leaned back now, letting the silence stretch again. The power of her pacing was undeniable. Hit, pause, let the blow land, then strike again. Justice Thomas, you once wrote that law should be blind to personal interest, and yet... She lifted a final sheet, her voice lower now, weighted with gravity. Your undisclosed gifts, your connections, your entanglements with wealthy benefactors tell a different story. If the law is blind, why does it seem to see so clearly when it comes to protecting privilege? The room froze. This was no longer just a debate. It was a reckoning. Thomas shifted in his seat, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for his water glass. His attempt to respond came halting, defensive. That is, Congresswoman, this is not relevant. But Crockett's gaze sliced through the excuse. Relevance. Justice Thomas, integrity is always relevant when you sit in judgment over millions of lives. The murmurs swelled again. Reporters typed furiously. On social media, the reaction was volcanic. She said what we've all been screaming at the TV for years. The receipts are on the table, and Thomas can't find his voice. GIFs of mic drops, fire emojis, and courtroom gavels flooded timelines. Crockett leaned in one final time. Her tone was steady, but the force behind it was undeniable. You say I misunderstand the law. I say you misunderstand justice. The Constitution was never meant to be a shield for the powerful. It was meant to be a promise to the people. And when those entrusted with upholding it twist it for their own ends, it is not my education that is in question. It is your integrity. The chamber erupted, not in applause, not yet, but in stunned silence broken only by the frantic clicking of cameras and the sharp breaths of those who had just witnessed something historic. Thomas's lips parted, but no words came. His smirk, once so effortless, was gone. His eyes darted to the papers laid before him, then back to Crockett, whose gaze did not waver. And then came the line, soft but sharp enough to cut through marble. So if you'd like to lecture someone today, Justice Thomas, I suggest you start with the man in your own mirror. The silence that followed said more than words. The silence in that chamber didn't stay contained within four walls. Within seconds, it detonated across the country like a thunderclap. The clip of Jasmine Crockett's takedown, her voice steady, her eyes locked on Clarence Thomas as he sat speechless, hit social media feeds before the echo of her words had even faded. And the internet did what it does best. It turned a moment into a movement. On Twitter, the hashtags caught fire. Hashtag Crockett vs. Thomas. Hashtag receipts don't lie. Hashtag mirror moment. By noon, Crockett's name was the #1 trending topic worldwide, eclipsing celebrity scandals, sports scores, and even international headlines. Millions of users clipped the final line, "Start with the man in your own mirror," looping it endlessly with captions like, "This is how you check power," and "Jasmine Crockett, the people's prosecutor." TikTok turned the confrontation into a cultural anthem. Users layered her mic drop line over beats, edited side-by-side comparisons of Thomas shifting uncomfortably while Crockett stayed poised, and flooded feeds with reaction videos. One creator, a young black law student in Atlanta, posted through tears, "This is the validation we've been waiting for. She's not just speaking to Thomas, she's speaking to every gatekeeper who ever told us we didn't belong." That video alone racked up 3 million views in a single day. Mainstream media couldn't ignore it either. CNN ran the headline, "Congresswoman Crockett stuns Justice Thomas in heated exchange." MSNBC replayed the confrontation on a loop, with commentators calling it a generational moment of truth-telling. Even networks reluctant to give Crockett airtime framed it as a clash that could not be overlooked. The image of Thomas fumbling for words sat side by side with Crockett's unwavering stare on nearly every front page. Supporters flooded her offices with calls, emails, and letters. Constituents who had voted for her once said they'd never felt prouder. Immigrants shared stories of watching with their families, saying Crockett's defiance felt like a validation of their own struggles. In barbershops, college dorms, and church basements, people replayed the clip, dissecting it like a championship replay. Meanwhile, Thomas's allies scrambled. Conservative commentators tried to spin the moment, calling Crockett grandstanding or overprepared, but their words rang hollow, drowned out by the viral replay of Thomas's own silence. Even political opponents of Crockett admitted privately that she had delivered a masterclass in composure and command. Celebrities joined the wave. Kerry Washington tweeted, "I felt that in my soul. Thank you, Congresswoman Crockett, for standing tall." Ava DuVernay shared the clip with the caption, "History has a new face." Even LeBron James weighed in. "Man, this is leadership. Respect." Late-night hosts had their say, too. Stephen Colbert joked, "Clarence Thomas is used to being silent on the bench, but I've never seen him silenced like this." The audience roared, and the clip added fuel to a fire already blazing. But this wasn't just entertainment, it was transformation. Crockett was no longer just a rising congresswoman from Texas. She had become a national voice, a truth-teller, someone who embodied the courage people were desperate to see in their leaders. Overnight, she was booked for primetime interviews, her calendar filled with invitations to speak at rallies, conferences, and law schools. Everywhere she went, people repeated her words back to her. "Start with the man in your own mirror." And the ripple effect was undeniable. Young women of color posted videos declaring they felt seen for the first time in political discourse. Lawyers dug up their old case notes, celebrating how Crockett had turned dry constitutional law into, a weapon of accountability. Even high school debate teams started analyzing her performance, citing it as a model for commanding presence under pressure. For critics, the challenge was undeniable. Clarence Thomas, once untouchable, suddenly appeared vulnerable. Questions about his credibility resurfaced with fresh intensity. Editorial boards penned scathing op-eds. Legal scholars revisited his past contradictions. For every attempt to defend him, there were thousands of voices replaying Crockett's words and asking, if he can't defend himself in the light, how can he defend the Constitution in the dark? And yet, through all the noise, Crockett remained grounded. When asked about her viral fame, she brushed it off. "This isn't about me," she told one interviewer. "It's about the people I represent. It's about truth being louder than privilege." That humility only fueled the admiration, making her not just a political figure, but a cultural one. The shockwaves were seismic. A single exchange had shifted perception, recalibrated the balance of power, and placed Jasmine Crockett firmly in the national spotlight as a defender of dignity and justice. But for Clarence Thomas, the damage had already been done. When the noise of the headlines and the roar of social media began to settle, what lingered wasn't just the clash of two figures, it was the lesson embedded in the moment. Jasmine Crockett had not merely scored points in a televised showdown, she had reframed the entire debate into something larger, something universal. For every dismissive smirk, she answered with composure. For every attempt to belittle her, she responded with preparation. For every ounce of arrogance, she brought twice the dignity. The contrast was undeniable. One man clinging to privilege, another to power, while a woman grounded in lived experience showed that truth is stronger than posturing. Crockett made clear that her words weren't about Thomas alone. "This is bigger than me, bigger than any single moment," she said in a follow-up interview. "What I stood up for is the principle that dignity matters more than arrogance, that truth will always outlast corruption, that service is worth more than status." And people believed her because they had seen it unfold in real time. They had watched her keep her voice steady, her gaze sharp, even as one of the most powerful men in America tried to dismiss her. They had watched her place evidence on the table with the quiet authority of someone who has lived the fight, not just theorized about it. They had witnessed the triumph of substance over spectacle. It resonated because it was a reflection of their own lives. Workers dismissed by bosses, students underestimated by professors, immigrants told they didn't belong, women talked over in boardrooms. In Crockett's calm defiance, millions saw themselves rising, unflinching, against the weight of entrenched power. The lesson echoed far beyond politics. Dignity, arrogance, truth, corruption, service, status. These weren't just slogans. They were values etched into the fabric of what America aspires to be. And in that chamber, for one fleeting but unforgettable moment, those values had been defended with clarity and courage. Commentators began calling Crockett's confrontation a mirror moment for America, a reminder that the true strength of democracy isn't found in the titles of those at the top, but in the integrity of those willing to challenge them. Her stand wasn't just political theater, it was a declaration that the underdog can still win when armed with truth. And so, Crockett became more than a congresswoman from Texas. She became a symbol, a reminder that progress is built not by the arrogance of those insulated by power, but by the resilience of those who dare to confront it. She showed that even in an era of cynicism, authenticity still matters. That preparation and principle can silence privilege. Narrator. This wasn't just about Crockett versus Thomas. It was about America choosing dignity over disdain. The chamber may have returned to quiet, but the echo of that choice, dignity over arrogance, truth over corruption, service over status, continued to reverberate in living rooms, classrooms, and community halls across the nation. And for those who had watched, the message was clear. No matter how high the walls of power, there is always room for truth to break through. And yet, as the dust settled, another question remained. What would these shockwaves mean for Clarence Thomas himself? Because while Crockett had emerged as a symbol of strength, Thomas was left facing the harsh light of scrutiny, and the damage was already beyond repair. Clarence Thomas mocked Jasmine Crockett. He dismissed her, smirked at her, treated her as though she were unworthy of the stage they shared. But in the end, it was Thomas who sat in silence, and it was Crockett whose words reverberated far beyond that chamber. The woman he tried to belittle became the voice America couldn't ignore, because this wasn't just about a single clapback. It was about what happens when arrogance meets preparation, when corruption collides with truth, when power underestimates courage. Crockett didn't just answer Thomas, she exposed the fragility of privilege when confronted by dignity. She showed in real time that you don't need a lifetime appointment to stand tall. You just need the courage to speak with conviction. And that's why this moment matters. It wasn't a headline, it was a turning point. Millions watched a powerful man falter, not because he lost his temper, but because he had no defense against the one thing power can't crush, the truth. Crockett gave voice to the underdog, the underestimated, the unheard, and she proved something timeless. That power without integrity will always crumble before truth spoken with courage. This is why we tell these stories, because they remind us that dignity is not weakness, that resilience is not silence, and that even in the face of towering institutions, one person's courage can shift the balance. If you felt that, if you saw yourself in Crockett's defiance, then don't let this moment fade. Share it. Talk about it. Be part of the movement that says arrogance will no longer go unchallenged. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of truth-tellers standing tall, for more moments where courage shatters corruption. Because every time we lift these voices, every time we shine a light, we make it harder for privilege to hide in the shadows. This was Jasmine Crockett's moment, but the next one, well, that belongs to all of us.